Proper science, only that one can be called, whose certainty is apodictic. Cognition that can merely contain empirical certainty is only improperly called knowledge. That whole of cognition, which is systematic, can already be named science for that alone. And if the conjunction of cognition in this system is a connection of causes and effects, even rational science. If, however, these causes or principles in it, as for example in chemistry, still ultimately are only empirical, and the laws from which the given facts are explained by reason are merely laws of experience, then they carry no consciousness of their necessity with them, aren't apodictically certain. And then the whole doesn't deserve the name of a science in the strict sense, and chemistry should therefore rather be called systematic art, rather than science. Immanuel Kant. In this lecture, I want to start talking about Kant's thoughts. So I still won't talk about his actual philosophy. I will start doing that in a later lecture. Rather, I want to start by talking about what even is philosophy, according to Kant. That is a question that I think is always important and interesting to ask. Not just when it comes to Kant, but also when it comes to other philosophers. And that's why I think it's a shame that the question isn't asked more often. I don't see it discussed really in popular introductions to Kant or to other philosophers. Maybe there's one or two throwaway sentences about it at the start or somewhere, but that's about it. But even if you study this, I don't remember when I studied philosophology ever having a class talk in length about what is philosophy, what does philosophy mean to this or to that philosopher. I think it's an important and a helpful question, not just because, well, it's important to know what philosophy is in general, but rather because the way a specific philosopher, in our case Kant, answers that question provides help in understanding that particular philosopher. Because if you know what philosophy means to him, then you can better understand how he sees himself and how he sees his own project, how he sees what he is doing. And that's why I want to start off with this question. Well, and the answer Kant gives to the question, what is philosophy, is twofold. He says you can define philosophy according to the school concept of philosophy or according to the world concept of philosophy. What does he mean by that? Well, the school concept, that is what philosophy is to the school. And by school, Kant here doesn't mean like high school or whatever. He means the higher school. So he means the academy, the university. So the question is, what is philosophy as an academic subject? What is it as a science among other sciences? What is it as part of scholarship? But the answer to this question mainly concerns, well, the academy, the scholars. It's the school concept of philosophy. On the other hand, you have the world concept of philosophy. And by that, Kant means philosophy, or the part of philosophy, the parts that is relevant to the wider world. So, to the common people, to the unlearned people, to the non-scholarly world. So the philosopher as the wise man, as the man who has to teach the people something about right living, not so much about difficult metaphysics or whatever. I want to explain how Kant views philosophy according to both these concepts. I also want to stress that these two concepts they don't contradict each other. They are not two different definitions of philosophy that are at odds with each other. Rather, they complete each other. And Kant would say that the true philosopher should be a philosopher in the school and in the world sense of the word. I do want, however, to start off with the school concept of philosophy. And that might be a bit more dry one out of the two. After all, that is what Kant means. It's philosophy, the way it matters to academia, not so much the way it matters to the common people. But I still think it is quite interesting and important to know what Kant has to say about philosophy in the school sense. Well, according to the school concept, Kant says philosophy is a science. The question is, what kind of science? The science of what? And I don't want to answer that right away. In fact, I don't want to answer it at all in this lecture, but only in the coming one. Rather, I want to start off with a more general question, that is, what is science in general, according to Kant? I want to get two things out of the way first. One is when we are asked to define a concept. One way to go about it, that is quite prominent in philosophy, that is done by Kant a number of times, but that he didn't come up with, that already exists in ancient philosophy. One way to do it is to start off with the general concept, that's called the genus, and from there go down to the more specific concept called the species, by naming what is called the specific difference. One example. If you ask me, what is a German Shepherd? I could answer it is a being. That is the general term. The genus. What kind of being is the German Shepherd? It is a living being. So the beings can be split up into the living beings and the beings that don't live. And I can name the specific difference. So I can explain what is the difference between living and non-living beings. And then I can go further down. So living being is the species, but in the next step, it can again function as the genus and have its own subspecies. So I can say among the living beings, there are again different kinds. There are plants, there are animals, and the German Shepherd is an animal. And then I can go on. I can ask what type of animal is the German Shepherd. And so I can go down. I can say, what kind of animals are they? Well, German Shepherds are vertebrates. Again, what kind? They are mammals. What kind? They are dogs. What kind? And so I can go down till I reach the actual concept German Shepherd. And at each step, I give the specific difference. I tell you what is the difference between this species and the other kinds of subspecies. And this is also how I want to go about explaining the school concept of philosophy. So I want to explain what is science in general to Kant, and then I want to go down and talk about what different types of science does he talk about until we reach philosophy. And then philosophy itself shall also be divided into its different subcategories that Kant talks about. The second thing I want to preface this with is um, when you divide something. And that is, as I just explained, what I want to do here. I want to take a general concept and divide it into different sub-concepts. When you divide something, there are really only three ways in which you can do this, Kant says. And the third way, the transcendental division, is not important right now. It is important in Kant's philosophy, but I will put that aside here because for the topic of this lecture, it doesn't matter. So I will only talk about the first kinds of division, and that is the empirical division and the logical division. Well, in philosophy, empirical always means related to experience. So Kant says an empirical division is when you divide something in experience. So you first have an experience of it, you see it, you feel it, whatever, and then you divide it willfully. And by willfully, I don't mean that it has to happen completely blindly and randomly. Um, there certainly can be some sense to it. Maybe you found the thing you are dividing to have certain attributes, and you're dividing it according to these attributes. Um, like you could divide a group of people into men and women, but you could just as well divide it into other groups according to other attributes. You could take the same group of people and divide them according to hair color, and then you would have a group of blondes and a group of brown-haired people and a group of red-headed people. Um, so in that way, the division happens willfully, and there is no necessity to the specific division you are making. And that is why the empirical division, Kant says, is a polytomy, which is just a fancy way of saying you split things into many parts. Poly means many, and the second part of the word tomi, that's from the Greek word for splitting or cutting up. So you also know that from words like Adam or anatomy. So an empirical division can be, for example, when you carve up a cake. It's up to you whether you cut it into 2 pieces or 4 pieces or 10 pieces, whether you cut it into equal pieces or whether you make some bigger and some smaller.
Looks like a very good cake. Obelix, will you find me a cake knife?
May I?
Now, cut 3 pieces of this cake. 3 pieces, I said.
That's right, 3.
Greedy pig.
Or another example would be the divisions of a state. For example, my country of Germany has 16 states, which it is divided into. And of course, there are historical reasons. They are not completely random. Someone didn't just randomly draw lines on a map. But still, it is not necessary for Germany to have exactly 16 states. It could have less, it could have more. So that is an empirical division. On the other hand, by logical division, Kant means a division that is done by your intellect. A division that doesn't require experience, it only requires logical thinking about the object which you are dividing. And such a logical division, Kant says, always ends up being a dichotomy. So that means being split into 2 parts. Not many parts, not any random number of parts, but just 2. And that is because the logical division always divides a thing into A and non-A. So into one thing and its direct opposite. And there's no third option. So one example for a logical division would be dividing the concept of a being, of something that exists, into living beings and non-living beings. That is logical. That's not random. That's not done willfully. That doesn't require experience. That just requires thinking. And as soon as I think, well, a being can be alive, then my intellect can also think, well, and if it isn't alive, it's a non-living being. And those are the only 2 possible types of beings. Because there can't be a third. It's either alive or it isn't alive. There can't be something in between unless we want to consider zombies or whatever. And I might add that the division of, well, the concept of division into empirical divisions and logical divisions is in itself a logical division. It's an example for the second type. Because when you think about, well, how can I divide things, you either can do it empirically, willfully, and divide them into several parts, or you can do it with your intellect, you can do it logically, you can with necessity divide it into exactly 2 parts, A and non-A. Well, with that out of the way, I want to make clear that all the following divisions in this lecture and also in the next will be logical divisions. Kant isn't dividing the concept of science at random, at will. He is making logical divisions. And of course, when you have logically divided something into 2 parts, you can possibly divide each of these 2 parts into 2 again. So there can in total be more than just 2 types, but at each step, at each level, there are only 2. Each new division again yields 2 results. With that out of the way, what is science according to Kant? And I think that is an important question. And if you reflect about it a bit, you may find that, let's say, bigger and more important concepts are often quite hard to define. Everyone can probably tell me quite correctly what a fork is. But if I ask you what is science, or also what is life, what is art, what is culture, what is religion? Well, most likely some things are coming to your mind when hearing those words, but when asked to give a proper explanation, a clear explanation, you might find that quite hard. When it comes to science specifically, there is still a conflict about how exactly to define it. I mean, we all can point at certain things, certain activities, and say this is science. But why is it science? And some people would tell you that science is about falsification. So a statement can only be scientific if, in the case that it is wrong, it can possibly be falsified. So it can be proven to be wrong. Um, or people would tell you that science is about a specific method, about using a scientific method to find out things. You can try it for yourself and open up a dictionary or open up the Wikipedia article on science, and you will probably find that the usual explanations are not really satisfying. Um, there's a lot of talking, a lot of trying to explain in many words, but that just shows that the author of this or that definition is still struggling with defining it. Well, I think the answer Kant gives is quite the interesting answer. Um, it's different from the usual answers you might hear today, um, but it is an answer that is worth considering, I think. Kant says that science is a teaching. So it's something that can be taught, something that can be learned. However, the same is somewhat true for art. You can also learn to do art. So that's the first division we have, science and art. And what Kant says is that science is about knowing, and art is about being able to do something. So this works better in German because the German word for science is Wissenschaft, and the German word for to know is Wissen. Um, and the German word for art is Kunst, and the German word for to can, to be able to, is können. So Kunst and Können, Wissenschaft and Wissen, art and can, being able to, science and knowing, they are clearly related in the German. In English, it's not so clear because art and science both are words that originally come from the Latin. So the English word science is also about knowledge. Scire in Latin is to know. What does Kant mean by that? Well, he says, of course, when you know something, that also can mean that you are able to do something. For example, when you know how to turn off or how to turn on a certain machine. For example, I know which button on this camera in front of me I have to press in order to turn it on. And since I know that, I also can turn the camera on. So in this case, knowing something is enough to be able to do it. But that is because I know a general rule. The intellect, Kant says, is the faculty of rules. What exactly that means, I will address in a later lecture. But for now, it's enough to just have heard that. The intellect is about rules. And if I know a general rule, press this button and the camera will turn on, that's enough to be able to apply it. Exactly because it's a general rule, because it's always true. But in art, that is not the case. Let's take the art of fighting. Let's say sword art. Or let's take something like swimming. Those are arts, according to Kant. And I can learn general rules here, but if I just read a book about sword fights or about swimming, maybe I memorized certain movements, certain stances, but that probably won't get me very far in an actual fight. And here I can't just apply the same rule in the same way always. I can't just say, oh, when someone attacks me with in this way, with this kind of slice, then I can counter that like this. I have to take this specific stance and I have to make this specific movement, and that will work every time. Maybe that will work one time against one opponent, but another opponent, or even the same opponent in the next moment, would react differently to the same stance I'm taking. And for that reason, art requires more than just knowing a general rule. I have to decide case by case whether to apply this specific rule here or whether to do something else. So what I need is, Nietzsche would say, instinct. Kant would say I need judgment. I need to be able to judge whether and how to apply the general rules in specific cases. When it comes to arts, Kant makes a further division. He says there is something which he calls the useful arts, or also the bread arts, because through them you can make money and get bread. That is what we would call craftsmanship. So a carpenter or a smith, they are practicing useful arts. And on the other hand, we have beautiful arts. And that is what today we mostly associate with the word art. So the meaning of the word has kind of narrowed down since Kant's time. And now when we hear art, we almost exclusively think of the beautiful arts. So composing a song, writing a poem, painting a picture. And of course, we may find that the distinction between useful and beautiful arts is not always that clear. We will find that often what is meant to be a beautiful art, movies, books, music, is done not to create something beautiful, is done not to simply express an idea by the artist, but rather is done to create a product that can be consumed and to create something that does make money for the artist. We could call this, but that's what I'm saying. That's not Kant's terminology. We could maybe call this the entertainment art. And Kant says this is a degradation of beautiful art. When you do the beautiful arts to appeal to a certain audience and to get ahead in life, to make money with it, you are degrading the beautiful arts. Certainly more could be said about this. And after Kant, by later thinkers, more has been said about this. So this was a topic that the Frankfurt School, for example, was interested in. And I could here talk about Adorno and what he said about the culture industry. So think of, well, think of nowadays big blockbusters, for example. Think of Marvel movies that are not so much movies and more like a theme park ride, or of the latest Netflix show that you are binging now but will totally have forgotten about in a year. That is part of the culture industry, and that is what Kant would probably see as a degradation of art. However, I don't want to talk about this further because Kant only makes one or two remarks about this. It is not a topic that he really delved into in his philosophy. And that is probably because in his day, in the 18th century, it hadn't yet become such a big issue, such a big problem. The culture industry in this modern sense, in the way Adorno criticized it, hadn't yet been born. So I want to go back to the other side, to science. Science is about knowing, Kant says. In fact, he says science has two jobs. One is to expand our knowledge. So it should teach us new things. For example, the biologist might find a new species, a new kind of living being. Or the astronomer might find a new star, discover a star that we didn't know about before. And the second job of science is to correct and to restrict our knowledge. So if we have previously sought to be able to use magic, to summon demons to help us in our endeavors, then science should correct this incorrect knowledge and tell us, no, you can't do that. And here I want to already say, as a sort of side note that I will later come back to, Kant's critique of reason, of the philosophy of his day, or of pretty much all philosophy that came before him, this critique of Kant, which is what made him so famous, which is why he is considered one of the most important philosophers of all time, this critique is mainly about pointing out that philosophy, or more specifically metaphysics, is not meant to be a science of expansion. It can't expand our knowledge. So if the metaphysician thinks that by purely using reason he can somehow prove that God exists, or prove that we have an eternal soul that is not going to die, then he's wrong. He can't do that. Rather, what Kant's whole critical project is trying to show is that the job of philosophy or of metaphysics is to be a science in the second kind of sense. So to correct and to restrict our knowledge. So Kant would say the metaphysician can't prove that God exists, but if there's an atheist who claims to have proof that God doesn't exist, then the metaphysician can correct him and tell him, no, we can't go beyond the realm of the sensual, the realm of experience with our understanding. So you can't know something purely intelligible like God, and therefore you also can't know that it doesn't exist. But in the same way, when the fanatic shows up and says, I had a vision of the afterlife, I know what life after death looks like, I know there are so and so many angels in heaven, then the metaphysician also can correct that and tell him, well, you might have had a vision, but you can't really know if it actually was a vision of the afterlife or if you are just having hallucinations. Because once again, we can't go beyond the realm of the sensual with our knowledge. Beyond that, we can believe, but we cannot know. So that is, as Kant will show, the job of philosophy, of metaphysics, but that is something I will talk about more in later lectures. For now, the question is still, what is science? Its job is to expand or to correct our knowledge, but what actually is it? Because to just say science is about knowledge is clearly not enough. Because everyone has knowledge. Not just the scientist, but also the common person. That's the distinction Kant makes. So there's scientific knowledge and there's common knowledge. And I mean, even a child has common knowledge. So just having any sort of knowledge is not enough to call that science. Well, one could think that it is about the method, about the way you arrive at the knowledge, but that's actually not what Kant says. Actually, he doesn't care much about the method. That's not to say that he thinks all methods are equally good. Certainly, there are better methods to find out the truth, but at the end of the day, what matters is that you found out the truth, not how you got there. Well, then you could think that the difference between scientific knowledge and common knowledge is a material difference. That is to say, it is about the contents of the knowledge. So you could think the scientist knows different things than the common man. But that's not necessarily the case, Kant says. One and the same knowledge can be scientific or common knowledge. For example, the common man knows that when he has an object in his hand and he lets go of it, it's going to fall to the ground. And the physicist knows the same thing. So in this isolated case, they both have the same knowledge. And related to that, I also have to point out that science is not just about the quantity of the knowledge. So we can't just say someone is a scientist because he knows more than the common man. In fact, Kant would say that in certain cases, the common man probably knows more than the scientist. So, for example, when you have a hunter, a ranger, or some savage tribesman who spends all his time in the wood, in the jungle, he probably knows the jungle and the creatures, the living beings there, better than some biologist does. Or when you have a person who spends a lot of time with people, who spends a lot of time in society, having conversations with people, having social interactions, um, he might actually know people better than a certain psychologist does. What makes certain knowledge scientific, according to Kant, is therefore not the the content of that knowledge and also not the quantity of it, but rather the form of that knowledge. And that's a very important point. And we will find when I talk other about other topics related to Kant, um, you will find that it always repeats that Kant is always emphasizing the importance of form. And that I find is something that the unaufklärt have a problem understanding. Because to be unaufklärt means to be led, to be guided by something else, by something external. And that doesn't have to be another person. In a lot of cases, that is your own sensuality. Well, and what is it that you can perceive sensually? It is the matter, it is the content, it is that which you see, which you hear, which you feel, which you taste, which you smell. But form, on the other hand, is not something that your senses can pick up. It is something you have to think with your intellect. And if you can't think for yourself, you will struggle with grasping form. Maybe what I mean by that is not quite clear yet. Just bear with me through the next lectures and hopefully it will become more clear. Science is about the form of knowledge, I said. What does that mean? Well, as soon as you don't just have one thing you know, but at least two things. And, well, just knowing one thing would be kind of pathetic as a science. So let's assume that science is about more than just one piece of data. Well, as soon as you know at least two things, the question is, how are they related to each other? And Kant says there are only three possible types of relation. That's something that he deduces from his table of categories. I just want to point that out as a side note here, but I won't explain further what that means, what the table of categories is. I will go into that in the later lecture. For now, all we need to know is Kant identifies three kinds of relations. The first is a relation between a thing and its own attributes. So I can say my t-shirt is red. So it's in a way related to itself. It's related to the color red. That can be put aside now, because we right now don't care about a relation of a thing with itself. We care about the relations between various things. Well, of those, there are only two kinds, Kant says. You have subordination and you have coordination. So the things can be related by being placed sort of below each other, creating a war, Kant says, or they can be related by sort of being placed alongside each other. And that forms an aggregate. And here we have our difference between scientific knowledge and common knowledge. The common knowledge, Kant says, is just an aggregate of knowledge. It's fragmentary. It's random. He compares aggregates to piles of sand. In a pile of sand, you have many grains of sand, and the grains are singular. And the grains are not necessary. They don't need to be there. You could take one grain away, no one would notice. You could add a few grains, no one would notice. And also, not just is the specific grain of sand not necessary in the pile, its place in the pile is also not necessary. Maybe it's placed a bit on the right, maybe a bit on the left. Maybe you take one from the top and put it to the bottom. Doesn't matter. No one would really notice. Because in an aggregate, Kant says, the parts come before the whole. So the whole, the pile of sand, the aggregate, is just formed by bringing the parts together. But the parts also exist by themselves. Each grain of sand is self-contained, so to say, and could exist by itself. Doesn't need to be together with the other grains to exist. Well, on the other hand, scientific knowledge, Kant says, is systematic. Because here, our knowledge isn't just coordinated, it's subordinated. It forms a war, and the system is a certain kind of war, of subordination. And the system, Kant compares not with a pile of sand, but with the body of an organism. So in an organic body, the parts don't come before the whole. You don't have a hand and a brain and a foot and a heart just randomly coming together to form a body, but rather the whole comes before the parts. And the parts only exist as parts of the whole. You can't just take them out of the whole. I mean, of course you could cut off the hand or something, but then it's no longer really a hand. It's useless. It can't move anymore, it can't grasp things anymore, and it will soon wither and rot away. And also in a system, like in an organic body, each part has its specific place. The hand belongs at the end of the arm. You can't just take the hand off the arm and attach it to the forehead or something. Or you can't just take the heart and put it into the head instead of the brain. That makes no sense. And that is also why Kant says a system can grow, but just like the body of a living being grows, but that growth doesn't change the general shape it doesn't change the system, it only expands the content of the system. So when I have the pile of sand, I can put new sand on one side or on the other side and thereby give it different shapes. Maybe make it rise up to the right or rise up to the left. But when, for example, the child grows up and the body grows, it expands, but the general anatomy stays the same. The child growing up won't suddenly sprout new legs, or the mouse won't suddenly move down to the belly or whatever. And that's also true about science, Kant says. Science should grow, should expand, but it doesn't necessarily change the system of science. So when I take, for example, mathematics, and it has its subgroups, it has geometry, it has arithmetic, then maybe I can solve a new problem in geometry that previously we didn't know how to solve. So our knowledge about geometry and about mathematics in general has expanded, but within the bounds of geometry, it hasn't changed the layout, so to say, of mathematics as a system. And this is what scientific knowledge is about for Kant. It is systematic. In order to be a system, it needs an idea. A system is created according to an idea. Kant doesn't just compare it with an organic body. He also, at some points, compares it with a pyramid. And if you imagine building a pyramid, then what comes first? What comes first is the idea in the mind of the architect. And the pyramid is erected according to that idea. And that idea tells you what parts are needed, so what stones you need, and it also tells you where to put them. Again, if we take a grain of sand from the pile, no one will notice. But if we take a stone out of the pyramid, maybe the whole pyramid won't break down because of one stone. But we will certainly notice that there's a hole at this specific place that should be filled. And that's what having a system means. When you have the general idea of a science like mathematics or like philosophy as a system, then there are, so to speak, empty slots that are waiting to be filled. And surely you have to expand your knowledge, you have to think, you have to do research, you have to do experiments to fill these slots. But the slots themselves, they are not something you first need to find through experience or experiments. They are something that already exists in your idea, and they are something that guides you when doing your research. So to Kant, once again, specific knowledge is not scientific simply because you arrived at it through the scientific method, simply because you did experiments and you double checked it, you repeated the experiment and you had it peer reviewed and whatever. That's not enough to make it scientific, according to Kant. What is needed to make it scientific is to place it, to integrate it within a system of knowledge. What makes it scientific is the way it is connected to the rest of our knowledge. And through this systematic connection, it becomes necessary. as part of the system. Just like in an organic body, each part, for example, the heart or the brain, is necessary, and you would notice if it was missing. So let's take, for example, the knowledge that the sun rises every morning. Once again, the same knowledge can be scientific knowledge or common knowledge, depending on whether it's systematic or not. For the common man has always known since the Stone Age that the sun rises in the morning. However, that in itself is not systematic knowledge. It's not connected to any other knowledge we have. And therefore, it doesn't seem to be necessary. Subjectively, for the common man, the sun rising in the morning is not necessary. It's simply something that he observed happening always, or rather, that he observed has always happened so far, but he doesn't understand it as being necessary. So, as far as he knows, it might not happen tomorrow. So, which could lead to, for example, myths like in ancient Egypt, where there was this myth about the sun at night going through the underworld and having to fight a monster, having to fight a snake, and if it were to lose, it wouldn't rise the next morning. Now, the scientist, on the other hand, he knows that the sun rises every morning, but in his mind, this piece of knowledge is not isolated, it's not random, it's connected with other knowledge within a system. He knows why the sun rises. He knows that the earth is turning around, and therefore he understands that the sun has to rise as soon as the part of the earth where we are is turning so that it faces the sun again. And he understands that it is not possible for the sun not to rise unless the earth were to stand still. And I think this is quite important because indeed the common person has knowledge, maybe even has a lot of knowledge in certain regards, but only in the form of an aggregate. And we all can reflect on our own knowledge because even if we are learned people, even if we studied a certain subject, even if we are experts in a certain subject, all of us are also lay people in other areas. Nobody knows everything. Nobody is an expert on everything. So we all should be able to reflect about the areas where we don't really have expertise, where we don't really have scientific knowledge. And we will find that maybe we have bits and pieces of knowledge, but they don't really systematically connect, and therefore they are not really necessary. One piece of knowledge could be taken away, could be replaced with something else, just like the grain of sand. And for us, it wouldn't make a big difference. But for the expert who knows this topic systematically, it would make a difference. He would probably understand that it couldn't just be different. And I often find this to be a problem, that the common person, that the unaufklärt person, is not systematic in their thinking. this is, for example, what makes conspiracy theories possible. People saying, I don't know, there is no climate crisis, there is no COVID, the Earth is flat. Let's go with this last one. Let's go with the Earth is flat. In the mind of the common person, the knowledge that the Earth is a globe is one piece of knowledge. And then they also have other pieces of knowledge. They know that when they let go of an object in their hand, it falls to the ground. But these are not connected. These are like grains of sand in a bigger pile. And just like you could take one grain away and replace it with another grain, so you could take one piece of knowledge away and take it with another, and replace it with another. So the Earth, well, I have heard that it's a globe, but it might as well be flat, with nothing else in the world changing, with everything else I know about staying the same. So the Earth is now flat, but things still fall to the ground when I let go of them. Well, when you are a scientist and you have systematic knowledge, you see how different phenomena are connected. You know that, well, things fall to the ground because of gravity. And that same gravity that pulls everything towards the center of the Earth also makes it necessary for a heavenly body, for a planet, for a star, to be round. It can't possibly have another shape. If everything is pulled towards the center, it naturally has to form sort of a globe. It can't just be a disk. That doesn't make sense. And of course, there are many other problems with thinking the Earth is flat. I don't want to go into all of them. This is not a flat Earth debunking video. There are enough of those out there. But I just want to point out that it is only possible for you to believe in conspiracy theories if you don't think systematically, because then it's very easy to just exchange one truth for another truth. But when you have to connect these various truths, you will find that they don't all connect neatly. Only some would form a system. So scientific knowledge in general is defined as systematic knowledge by Kant. When we ask now what types of science or of scientific knowledge are there, the question has to be, well, what kinds of knowledge are there? And Kant says there are only two different kinds. If we look at it objectively, so from the perspective of the object we want to know, then knowledge is either rational, that is, knowledge that we can arrive at through reason, through applying thought. Take mathematics, for example. The solution to a certain multiplication is not something we have to first experience. We have to first do experiments about. We can arrive at that through thinking. On the other hand, there is empirical knowledge. And that is something we find through experience. For example, the fact that ravens are black. You can think about the concept of a raven as long as you want. Your reason will never lead you to conclude that they have to be black. But if you see ravens, you see that they are generally black. Now, we can also look at it subjectively. So, from the perspective of the subject, which is wanting to know something. And in that case, the division is between rational knowledge and historical knowledge. Again, rational meaning you arrived at the knowledge through reason, through thinking. Historical, on the other hand, in the terminology of 18th century philosophy, this doesn't mean what you might be thinking of when you hear the word history nowadays. So this isn't necessarily about the history of humans and what humans did in the past, but through history in this sense is a kind of historical knowledge. But historical knowledge has a broader meaning. It means any kind of knowledge where you take up a certain fact that was already there, either through your own experience or through somebody teaching it to you, a teacher, a book, whatever. So that means that something that subjectively is known rationally also has to objectively be rational knowledge. You can't yourself arrive at a certain truth through thinking if it is not a rational truth, if it is not a truth that one can arrive at through thinking. But on the other hand, if knowledge is historical knowledge subjectively, then it could, when we consider it objectively, it could be empirical knowledge or it could be rational knowledge. So all empirical knowledge necessarily has to be historical. You either saw ravens yourself and recognized that they are black, or you had someone tell you that ravens are black, but you certainly didn't find out rationally through using reason. But knowledge that objectively is rational knowledge can subjectively be historical knowledge. For example, philosophy, Kant's philosophy is objectively rational knowledge, and Kant himself arrived at it rationally. But you, right now, are learning about it in a historical way, by me telling you about it, not by you yourself thinking and having the same thoughts that Kant had. These two types of knowledge would mean that there are two types of science. One would be rational science, dealing with things, that can be understood rationally. And the other Kant calls historical scholarship. Sometimes he also just says historical teaching, but I don't think that's such a good way of naming it, because, the word teaching is also used by Kant as a general umbrella term. So then you would say there are two types of teachings: rational science and historical teachings. I don't think that's such a good way to call it, because it could be a bit confusing. So I will go with naming the different types of teachings: rational science and historical scholarship. Scholarship, according to Kant, being something that can be learned, that can be taught, but where there isn't really understanding because rational science is also named the science of understanding by him. Because when you understand something rationally, it becomes necessary for you. It truly becomes knowledge. Knowledge meaning not just to be aware that something is this or that way, but to really know that it has to be that way. And that is because rational science deals with laws. What is a law? A law means that if A happens, B has to follow with necessity. If A can happen and sometimes B follows, but sometimes A is followed by C instead, then we wouldn't say that there's a law between A and B. I mean, that is how we understand laws in the state, right? So, for example, when I say in my state, in my country, murder is forbidden by law, and if you commit murder, you go to jail. Then that would mean that every time someone murders a person, so every time A happens, B has to follow. They have to get imprisoned. If you lived in a country where it was possible for someone to commit murder and maybe go to prison, but then another time someone else commits murder and that person doesn't go to prison, maybe because he bribed the judge or because he's the president's brother or whatever, you couldn't say that this country is really ruled by law. You would say it's a corrupt country. And the same is even more true for natural laws. For example, the laws of gravity. We expect here on Earth, when we let go of an object in our hand, we expect for it to drop down to the floor. This can't just happen sometimes, and at other times, randomly, the object doesn't fall down but floats up. Then there wouldn't be a law. There being a law means the object always has to drop down. And when you have a law, then and only then can you truly know, can you truly understand this thing. Fichte, who built on Kant and completed Kant, often says more or less the same thing as Kant, but much more clearly. And where Kant likes to speak of rational knowledge, Fichte often speaks of genetical knowledge. And I think that might help in understanding better. Because genesis means something is generated, something is created. So why does Fichte call this genetical knowledge? Well, he says the scientist, the one who knows the law, doesn't need, as soon as he does know the law, doesn't need to see the specific cases. He doesn't need experience of the specific cases to know what is going to happen. He just needs to know the law, and he sort of sees in his mind how things are going to unfold. So he has genetical knowledge because he sees the genesis of the specific event according to the law. So since I know the law of gravity, when I'm holding an object and I'm letting go of it, I don't need to wait and see what's going to happen. I know beforehand that the object will drop down. Or likewise, if I throw a rock at a window made of glass, I don't need to wait till the rock collides with the window and see what's going to happen. I know beforehand that it's going to break. So that is genetical knowledge, Fichte would say, because I can see it unfold in my head, so to speak, before it happens in real life. And the experience is only confirming afterwards what I already knew was gonna happen. So then science isn't so much about knowing or being aware of the specific singular fact or the specific singular event, but rather it is about understanding that singular event because we have knowledge of a law which made that event necessary. On the other hand, the historical knowledge is not real knowledge at all. We could call it awareness. If I meet a new person and we are introduced and he tells me his name is Fritz, for example, then I'm now aware that his name is Fritz. I have historical knowledge of it because I was told. But we shouldn't really say, if we were to speak properly, we shouldn't really say that I know his name is Fritz because I don't understand it. I'm aware of it being a fact, but it's a random fact to me. He could also be named Ali or whatever. His parents probably picked that name. They could have picked another name. I don't see how him having this specific name is necessary, and therefore there's nothing to really understand here. There's only something to be aware of. And that is why historical scholarship isn't proper science. That's not to say it's unimportant or it's worthless or whatever. But Kant would say it can be scientific if the things we are historically aware of are subordinated, if they are systematic. But even with it being scientific, it's not science in the proper sense. Because this knowledge we have, or rather this awareness, doesn't come with necessity. I might make a side note here. I find it a problem that people often don't understand things, even if they could be understood rationally, but only become historically aware of things. This happens in school a lot. This is, I think, a huge issue in the way our school system teaches. I have, for example, found this often when tutoring students in math. Let's take as an example the Pythagorean theorem. Objectively, like all mathematical knowledge, it is rational knowledge. But for the average student in high school, it isn't really rational knowledge. It is just historical awareness. It is something the teacher or the book told the student is the case, and the teacher talked this specific formula. The teacher talked, well, you have to add the square of a to the square of b, and then you get the square of c. But as far as the student understands, not objectively. Objectively, of course, this is a law. This has to be. There is no other way a white triangle can be. But subjectively, in the mind of the student, this formula is completely random. It just so happens, and the student is aware that the teacher talked, you have to add the square of a and the square of b. But as far as the student understands, the teacher could also have talked, you have to subtract the square of b from the square of a. And this becomes a problem. I have often found, for example, that students had to, they were given the lengths of two sides of a triangle, and they had to calculate how long would be the third side. And they mindlessly started squaring both of these sides and adding those two squares. Even if the sides given were not the two shorter sides, but one short side and the longest side. And in this case, of course, they should have squared the longer side and subtracted the square of the shorter side. And this is a mistake that you can't really make if you understood the formula, if you understood the Pythagorean theorem, if you understand what is happening here, because then you would realize, well, to square the sides is not a random expression. I'm literally squaring them. I am, so to speak, drawing squares on the three sides of the triangle. And then it would become very, very obvious that, well, maybe if I add the areas of the two squares that I can draw on the two shorter sides, maybe then I get the area of the square that I draw on the longer side. But then it would immediately become evident and obvious for our intuition that it can't be possible that we add the area of the bigger square with the area of one of the smaller squares, and the result would be the area of the other small square. That's every child would immediately understand that that's not possible. So we should strive to understand things rationally. That is, of course, if it is objectively rational knowledge. If it's objectively empirical knowledge, then there is only being historically aware of, but there is no true knowing, no true understanding. And therefore, true science, in the way Kant defines it, is only the rational science. So is only the science that deals with laws. But this kind of science can again be divided into two subcategories. And that is what Kant calls pure science, or science proper, and applied science. And this is a good point in my lecture to explain two terms that Kant often uses and that are very important to understanding Kant's whole philosophy. Two terms that I will not just use in this lecture, but I will come back to again and again in the next lectures. And these two terms are a priori and a posteriori. Now that is Latin, and what it means is basically just before and after. And before and after, in this case, means before and after experience. However, I want to stress that this is not to be understood in a temporal sense. So when Kant speaks of knowledge a priori, he doesn't want to say it is knowledge that in time comes before experience. Because in time, there is no time before experience for us. A baby is born and the baby starts perceiving things, seeing, hearing, feeling, and this experience probably in time comes before starting to think rationally and starting to, for example, come up with mathematical formulas. So a priori means knowledge before experience, not in the temporal sense, but it means that you probably had any sort of experience before coming to this knowledge, but you didn't need to have experience of the object that this knowledge is about to come to this knowledge. So, for example, when I say that every triangle has 180 degrees, that's a priori knowledge. That doesn't mean that temporarily I arrived at that knowledge before ever in my life experiencing a triangle. I probably saw triangles long before I talked about degrees. But I don't need to experience triangles. I don't need to see 1,000 triangles and to go and measure how many degrees they have to arrive at the knowledge that they all have 180 degrees. I can arrive this through reason. And that's why it is knowledge a priori. And on the other hand, a posteriori knowing something, or rather, as I have now termed it, being aware of something, not really knowing, that is when you need experience to arrive at this awareness. Once again, I want to stress that unaufklärt people, because they can't think for themselves, are led by their senses, by what they see, what they hear, and so on. And that is why they are very much focused on the a posteriori. A priori knowledge requires a certain amount of Aufklärung. It requires being able to use your reason and to think for yourself. And I have often found that unaufklärt people struggle with it. It has two characteristics that show that something is knowledge a priori and that differentiate this knowledge from awareness a posteriori. And that is necessity and universality. First off, necessity. When we know something a priori, we know that it is necessary. In other words, we know not just that it is, but we know that it has to be this way and it can't possibly be any other way. So I know a priori that all triangles have 180 degrees. I know it has to be this way. It isn't possible for any triangle to be any other way. On the other hand, I know, or rather I'm aware of the fact that ravens are black a posteriori. That means, in my mind, it's not necessary for them to be black. I could definitely imagine ravens to be red or pink or green. In this context, I find it very interesting to consider that nowadays we tell lots of fantasy stories, right? We have movies, video games, books in fantasy worlds. And these contradict what we know about reality in many ways, right? There are dragons, there are unicorns, there's magic. This contradicts what we know about the world. And I mean, this doesn't really just go for fantasy stories. It also goes for other stories that somehow contradict the real world. It's like I can write an alternative history story where the Nazis won World War II. That's not exactly fantasy, but it's still contrary to the facts, because the fact is that they lost World War II. But what I find interesting about this is that all these facts that the stories we tell are contradicting are only facts that we are aware of a posteriori. And even the most creative, even the most fantastical of stories is not able to contradict what we know a priori. So a fantasy author can create a world with different laws of nature, with, for example, magic, but no fantasy author can create a fantasy world where the circles have angles. Because it is necessary for a circle, in order to even be a circle, to be perfectly round. And that means a circle can't have angles. It is necessary that every possible point on a circle has the exact same distance to the center of the circle as every other point. If that wasn't the case, if some points had a wider distance to the center and others had less of a distance, then the circle would have a dent or an angle, and it would no longer be a circle. It would maybe become elliptical or something. And therefore, even in a fantasy world, no matter how magical and fantastical it is, this can't be changed. I mean, if you're an author, no one is stopping you from writing, well, in my fantasy world, the circles have edges. But those would just be empty words. You could write them down, but no one could really imagine anything when reading that. And that would become obvious as soon as we tried to make a movie out of that fantasy book. So as soon as we tried to turn the words into images. Now, the second characteristic of a priori knowledge can be concluded from the first one, from the necessity. And that is universality. If I know a priori that something is true, then I know that it's not just true in some cases, but rather that it is true in every case. If I know that a triangle has 180 degrees, and I'm sticking to mathematical examples because they are the most self-evident. But in later lectures, I will talk about other a priori knowledge. If I know that a triangle has 180 degrees, I know this isn't just true for some triangles or for most triangles or for all triangles except one. I know it is the truth for all triangles. And as I said, that follows from the first characteristic, because that's what necessity means. If something is true necessarily, it has to always be true. It has to be true in each and every single case. On the other hand, Kant says that which I know or which I'm aware of a posteriori can never have true universality. It can at best have comparative universality. That is to say, it can have generality. So it can be true in general, it can be true in most cases, but we can never say that it is a universal truth, that it always has to be this way. Kant says that there are two ways when it comes to a posteriori knowledge, two ways to generalize our knowledge. And that is through induction and through allegory. Now, induction means that you have a singular case, or it would be better to have several singular cases, and you sort of go upwards from there. You generalize those singular cases. So, for example, you saw 1,000 white swans, and now you're generalizing and you're saying all swans are white. But that obviously is not universal knowledge. It is just a general truth. In general, swans are white. So, after seeing 1,000 white swans, it is not unreasonable to assume, even before I see it, that the 1,001st swan I'm gonna see is going to be white too. But I can't be sure that it won't be a black swan. And Kant warns of this. For example, he likes to joke about those people, those travelers who travel other countries, who travel through France or through England, and who visit 3 or 4 inns and who had an unfriendly host there, and then they inductively arrive at the general statement, well, this nation knows no hospitality, after knowing like 3 or 4 hosts in this nation. The second possible way to generalize our knowledge is through allegory, I said. And to Kant, allegory means that I know the relation between a thing A and a thing B that I both know. And from that, I conclude that the relation between a thing C, which I also know, and another thing X, which I don't know, is going to be the same as the relation between A and B. So for example, let's say we were flying to a faraway planet and we were to discover life on that planet. And we would find a life form, an animal or whatever, and we would see that on its head it has an opening, that it can open and close, and that opening has teeth. It would not be unreasonable to assume that this is a mouse and that it is used to eat, to consume food. And we would probably assume that even before having seen that animal eat anything. Simply because we know from our planet, from Earth, that there's a relation between A, the mouth of animals, and B, their food. So now we discovered C, the mouth of this alien, and we assume that there's the same relation to X, to whatever that thing is eating. But ultimately, that's just an assumption. Maybe it's not eating from there. Maybe it's not eating anything. Maybe it lives in some other way. And maybe that's not its mouth. Maybe that's its butt and it's pooping from there. Who knows? Kant gives two examples for an conclusion through allegory. One is, he says that in the earliest days of humanity, maybe some person was throwing seeds to the ground. Maybe the seeds of some wheat or whatever. And that person probably discovered that the seed wasn't rotting, but rather was growing into a plant. And so that person probably concluded that the same could be done with the seeds of another plant. That person probably concluded they could take the seeds of an apple and plant them, and an apple tree would grow out of that. That was concluded then through allegory. The other example Kant gives is an astronomical example. That was the topic Kant was very interested in. Kant already wrote about in his pre-critical period. I will talk more about this at a later time. And here Kant says, for example, well, we know that our sun is circled by a number of planets, and they in turn have moons, or some of them have moons. And now we look at the night sky and we see many, many stars out there. We can make an allegory with our solar system, and we can assume that those stars, or many of those stars, are also going to have planets. But we don't know for sure. I mean, nowadays we do know, since we have better telescopes than in Kant's time. But back then it was first a conclusion that he drew from allegory between our solar system and the suns of presumably other solar systems. But in both cases, induction and allegory, I don't arrive at true universality. So only when I know something a priori, only then is it necessary and universal knowledge. And again, I find that unaufklärt people have very, very huge problems in thinking true necessity and true universality. To them, anything seems random, even if they don't outright say so. And actually, they are unlikely to outright say so, because to say so, they would have to have the concept of something that isn't random, of something that is necessary to compare the random with, and to come to the conclusion that everything is random because it's not necessary. They can't even understand that, because necessary is something they can't really think. And that is a huge problem in many cases, and I think that is a topic that I will come back to in other lectures on Kant. For now, I want to stay at the topic of science. And if we look back at the earlier explanations, if we look back at the earlier distinction of systematic knowledge I made, then we can say that the historical scholar is someone who a posteriori is aware of facts, while the rational scientist is someone who can deduce the singular fact from a law, and so he knows the fact a priori. He knows that this event has to happen, that this fact has to be the case according to this law. Again, this is what Fichte called the genetical knowledge. So, this rational science now, Kant divides into pure science and applied science. And here applied doesn't mean practical science. So please don't think that, for example, applied physics would mean, I don't know, building rockets or whatever. No, science as science is always theoretical to Kant. Of course, it can be used for practical, for technical, technological tasks. It can be used to solve them and to achieve things practically. But insofar as it is science, it is only about knowledge. It is only about theory. So applied science, in the way Kant uses the word, applied science is still theoretical science. The difference is that pure science is pure from experience. So it is solely rational. While applied science applies reason onto experience. Because we can ask ourselves this: the singular fact, the singular event is necessary because it follows from a law. That's all fine and good. But how do we know about this law in the first place? And here too, I can know the law a priori, and then I have pure science. Or I can find that law through experience, through research, through experiments, and then I have applied science. So let's take natural science as an example. There is, Kant would say, pure natural science. Metaphysics of nature, because Kant says that in every scientific subject you have a pure science and you have an applied science, and the pure science he calls metaphysics. So you have metaphysics of nature, but you would also have metaphysics of psychology. You would even have to have metaphysics of history, if history shall be a science. And Kant would say that applied science is usually bigger. It has a wider area of topics, of research, of knowledge. And it never really ends. You can always find out more when researching empirically. And you will always have mysteries left. You will also always have questions left that you can't answer. But in metaphysics, so in pure science, Kant says all questions have to be answerable. That's not to say solvable, because the answer could sometimes be we can't solve this question. But even then, that is something we can know for sure. It's not just the case in metaphysics that we have to say, well, so far we didn't solve this question. We have to keep thinking. We have to keep experimenting. We have to keep try new solutions. But rather in metaphysics, it has to be possible to understand this question can't be solved. We might as well stop thinking about it because it's not solvable, and we can at least understand why it is not possibly solvable. And so in metaphysics, maybe there's just a small number of questions, but those questions all have to be answerable, Kant says, for a simple reason. We are not dealing with an object here, with something that is strange and foreign to us, because if we are dealing with a strange object, with something empirical, we will probably never penetrate it fully. But in metaphysics, we are dealing with our own reason, with our own rationality, and we are not dealing with any questions that are given to us from the outside, so to speak, but with our own inner questions, and that's why they all have to be answerable. Now, back to the example I wanted to give. So natural science, Kant says, has to have a metaphysics of nature. That's the pure science. And it has to contain physics. That's the applied science. And metaphysics of nature contains certain laws that we know to be true a priori. So, for example, metaphysics of nature would tell us that in this universe, energy can't ever get lost, nor can new energy be added out of nowhere. The total energy always has to stay the same. And metaphysics of nature would tell us that perpetuum mobile, so a machine that keeps running and running and running, is not possible. If you want to keep a machine running, you have to always give it new energy, which then will be converted into movement. And when you stop fooling that machine, it will necessarily also sooner or later, when it runs out of energy, stop moving. And that is not something that we need to prove through experiments. That is something our reason tells us. We know this to be necessarily and universally true. But on the other hand, in applied natural science, we have many laws that we know about because we discovered them in nature. Chemistry, for example, is full of those laws. So what elements are there in the universe, and how do those elements function? How do they react with each other? How can they connect, or maybe they can't connect? And so, for example, we have certain rules about, let's say, metals. we know that if something is a metal, it's a heat conductor. So according to this law, I don't have to do experiments with every single object that is made out of metal. I don't have to actually try, well, what will happen if I heat it on one side? Will the other side get hot too? I know, according to this law, that metals are heat conductors. I know a priori that this or that metallic object is going to be a heat conductor. However, this law itself, metals being heat conductors, is not something I can know a priori. I only know it a posteriori. And that means that I can't truly, in the truest sense, be sure that everything metallic is going to be a heat conductor. We could at least imagine, in some fantasy world, a metal existing which is not a heat conductor, but yet is still a metal. Or for example, take biology. Biology is also full of such laws that were only found empirically. So, for example, I know that animals evolve to be suited for the environment. So I know, for example, that the color of an animal's fur can depend on the environment, because it is beneficial for the animal to be hidden. If it's a predator, it needs to stay hidden so the prey won't spot it too early. And if it's prey, it needs to be hidden to not be spotted by a predator. So let's say I was going to the North Pole and I wouldn't know about the animals there. Let's say I never heard about polar bears or polar foxes or whatever. But I know that it's cold at the North Pole and that there's a lot of snow there. Or at least there was before the climate crisis. Knowing that there's snow and knowing that animals often have a similar color to their environment, I can deduce a priori that the animals I'm going to find there are going to be white. Or let's take another law of adaptation. Let's take something like Bergmann's law. We know that animals in colder climates tend to be bigger than related animals in warmer climates. So once again, let's say I'm going to the Arctic, or I'm going, let's say, not to the North Pole but to the South Pole this time, and I don't know yet what animals live there, but I've heard there are going to be penguins, and I have met penguins from America or from Africa, so penguins that live more up north, and those were small. If I know Bergmann's rule, I can assume a priori that the penguins I'm going to meet at the South Pole are going to be bigger than the ones I know, because it's colder there. So once again, as Fichte would say, I don't really need to know the singular fact. I don't have to have experience with that fact. The experience is just going to confirm what I already know, because this is knowledge that I see being created, so to speak, that I see genetically come into being in my mind. I don't have to remember, oh, where do the white bears live? Did the white bears live at the North Pole, or do they live here in the woods and the brown bears live at the North Pole? No, I just have to think about the law that animals adapt to their environment. And when I know that, well, at the North Pole, the environment is quite white, I know that the white bears, the polar bears, are living up at the North Pole. At the North Pole. I can deduce that from the law. But the law itself, once again, is not something I can know a priori. It's not necessary. And therefore, it doesn't have to be universally true that animals have a color adapted to their environment, or that animals become bigger in colder climates. This is a law we know through experience, through observation, through experiments, whatever. So that is how, according to Kant, we have two types of science. The pure science is science in the truest sense of the word, because only here we have true knowledge, we have true certainty. We know it can't be any other way. In the applied science, on the other hand, we can be certain about the singular facts, the singular events, insofar as they are necessary according to a law, but we can't really be fully certain about that law itself. And as I said, in every science, there needs to be both, Kant says. So, for example, there's pure mathematics, where we just calculate. And then, as examples for applied mathematics, Kant gives land surveying. So, if you have a landscape and you are trying to survey it, you are applying the general rules of geometry that you take out of pure mathematics to this landscape. So you are applying it to experience, because the rules of geometry are necessary, of course. But the landscape being the way it is, for example, this hill being that high and not higher or lower, or this slope being this steep, that is not necessary. That's just the way you find it to be. Another example of applied mathematics would be in astronomy, when you are calculating the movements of the planets. Those movements are empirical. But the general rules of mathematics that you are using, they are purely rational. The same goes for the natural sciences. Pure natural science, for example, tells us that everything in nature that happens happens according to a reason. There's a law of causality. That is the general law. When B happens, we have to assume there's an A that made it happen. However, which A causes which B, that's not something we can know through reason. That is something we can only know through experience. So Kant says, when I take clay and put it into the sun, and it turns hard. And on the other hand, when I take wax and put it into the sun, and it turns soft and starts to run, in both cases, I need to assume, because this is what pure natural science tells me, I need to assume that it happened for a reason. The clay didn't just randomly turn hard, and the wax didn't just randomly turn soft. in both cases, something needs to have happened beforehand to make this happen. But only through experience can I know that this is the effect of the sun, that this is the effect of heat. The general rule of causality is necessary and universal. I will talk more about why that is or how Kant knows that in a later lecture. But it is not necessary that the sun causes clay to turn hard. We could imagine a world where the opposite happens and where the sun makes clay soft but makes wax hard. Now, it would seem that in each field there are two sciences or two disciplines, the pure science and the applied science. However, there's actually a third, according to Kant, and that is the bridge between those two. In most of his writings and lectures, he only talks about there being two sciences in each field. But the need for a third that connects those two is something that he discovered in his last years. And the last work he ever wrote was about exactly that. He didn't finish that work, as I already talked about. We now have his notes under the title Opus Posthumum. But his last work was about making this connection in the field of natural science. Kant earlier had written a work, Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. And he was of the opinion that those metaphysical foundations had to come before empirical physics. But in this last work that he didn't finish, he wanted to build a bridge from his metaphysical foundations to empirical physics. And he wrote that this was the last gap in his system, that he had to close this gap to complete his system. And Kant himself only tried to build this bridge in the field of natural science, but he does mention that such a bridge would be needed in every field. And for example, Fichte after him tried to build it in the fields of the practical sciences. So Fichte asked, how do we get from pure morality, so just the pure moral law, to actual empirical human beings living a moral life? How can we apply morality to our specific condition? Or also, how do we get from philosophy of rights, so from reason telling us what is a human right, what is a reasonable law, how should the state, how should the economy reasonably function, how do we get from there to actual politics? How do we apply that to the world? Those are questions Fichte asked. So this is a question you can ask in every field. And the problem Kant discovered there at the end of his life is basically like wanting to mix water and oil, right? They are too different. They don't mix. And it's the same here. You have this a priori knowledge purely from reason, and you have this a posteriori knowledge or awareness from experience, well, they are so fundamentally different that it's hard to bring them together. And this, in one or the other shape or form, is an age-old problem in philosophy. Even back in ancient philosophy. Whenever you have any sort of dualism, whenever you have any sort of difference between form and content, between subject and matter, this problem comes up. Whether you have a hylomorphistic worldview, like many of the ancients did, so that would mean you assume there to be matter, some primordial matter, and on the other hand, which is fully formless, fully chaotic by itself, and on the other hand you have form, and this form is applied to matter, this form forms the matter. Then the question comes up, how is that possible? How can matter be brought into this form? Or you have, for example, at least since Descartes, the body-soul problem. Descartes said there are bodies, so there are material things, res extensor, extended things, and there are souls, there are spirits, res cogitans, thinking things. And that leads to the question, how could they possibly be connected? How is two bodies smashing together, so something touching my body, how does that anything to the soul? How do I feel that? And the other way around, how does the soul thinking something or wanting something, how does that move the body? And Kant also faced this problem in his philosophy. He said there are some purely intellectual concepts that are not taken from experience, but that are necessary for our experience. Well, if they don't come from experience, how can we apply them to the empirical? Kant always tries to solve this problem in the same way. More or less the same way you would try to solve it with in chemistry. If you want to mix oil and water, you can't. If you just have those two, it won't work. So what you need is a third substance that somehow connects with both of them. An emulgator that allows you to connect them through this third substance. That's what Kant tries in his teachings of the schemas, something I will talk about later on. And that is also what Kant tries here when connecting pure science with applied science. He says there needs to be a middle science, a sort of bridge, which has to be both somewhat rational and somewhat empirical. What does that actually look like? Well, he says this middle science needs to take data, needs to take specific laws out of observation, out of our experience. But the system through which they are ordered needs to come from reason. More specifically, it needs to come from the table of categories which Kant discovered. But that's a topic for a later lecture. For now, it's enough to say it just needs to come from reason. And that means that the content is empirical. The content is made up of empirical laws, but the form, the way those are systematized, is rational. And this, Kant believes, would lead the empirical researcher in his research. Maybe I can make this more clear through an image, through an allegory of sorts. Let's think of a biologist going to the jungle and discovering a new species. This is, of course, empirical. This is, of course, a posteriori. We didn't know beforehand there would be this new species, or it would be exactly this kind of species. However, if he is a scholar, if he's a biologist, he probably already has a system of biology, a taxonomical system in his head, right? So he knows there are certain types of living beings, of species. He knows there are plants, he knows there are animals. And so it is like he has drawers where he can place every new species in. So now that he found this new living being, he can immediately say, well, this is not a plant, this is an animal. And he can probably say what type of animal it is. He can maybe say, this is an insect. It's not a mammal, it's an insect. It's not a fish, it's not a bird, it's an insect. And this specific new animal he didn't know beforehand, but this category of insects, and therefore the place in the whole system, because he knows insects are related to these other kinds of animals, and they are closer related to these, further related to these, and so on. The specific place in the system for this new species, that was something he knew beforehand. But that is, as I said, just an allegory, because in this case, the system too is something we only know about a posteriori. We know of insects because we had experience that insects exist, but they wouldn't have to exist. We could imagine a world without insects, so their place in the system is not necessary. So what Kant speaks about when he talks about this middle science, this bridge between pure and applied science, is bringing the empirical laws under a rational system that we can come up with a priori. So it's like we are building the systematic skeleton of the science, or creating empty slots, or like we are creating a bunch of doors, and we don't know beforehand which specific objects we will find, and therefore in which drawer this object or that object will fit. We don't know that before experiencing the object, but we know beforehand, we know a priori which drawers there are, so where the object can potentially fall into, and where it can't, because there are no more drawers than the ones we already know a priori. That's sort of the last project, insofar as it concerned the natural science specifically. That's sort of the last project that Kant worked on. But that's it. That is what science in general means to Kant. It is about knowledge. It is different from common knowledge, not by the content or the quantity of the knowledge, but by the fact that it is not an aggregate of knowledge, of random knowledge, but rather that it is systematic knowledge. However, it's not just systematic historical scholarship, where the knowledge might be systematically ordered, but ultimately is not true knowledge, but just awareness of facts that, insofar as we know, are still random. No, it is actual rational knowledge, knowledge of laws and of facts that are necessary because of these laws. But when it comes to this rational knowledge, again, we can have pure science where even the law itself is rational, is necessary a priori, or we can have applied science where these pure laws are applied to experience and where we find empirical laws that don't have the same necessity, the same universality. Or certainly we can have a middle science that forms a bridge between those two by bringing the empirical laws under the rational system. In the next lecture, I want to talk about philosophy specifically in this system of sciences. Here I want to make some closing remarks about all of this. I hope it wasn't too dry or too long-winded or too complicated. I hope you were able to follow me. And as I said at the beginning, this may not quite be how science is defined usually, but I do think it is also not a completely random definition, but rather, well, Kant says it is the job of philosophy not to come up with completely new truths, to find completely new truths, but rather truth or concepts that already are in us, but that maybe aren't clear, that are dark, that are unconscious, need to be brought to clarity, need to be brought into our consciousness by philosophy. And even if before you didn't think about science in terms of being systematic knowledge, of being knowledge of laws that are necessary and universal, I think if you reflect about what you mean by the word science and what you always used to think when talking about science, you will find that at least unconsciously you somehow thought about this. I mean, we make a difference between soft sciences and hard sciences. And there's a reason, I think, that people consider something like physics to be more of a proper science, let's say, than psychology or sociology or history. And that is, I think, because here it is more about not just finding out about facts and becoming aware of the way things happen to be, but here it's more about laws and understanding the way things need to be because of those laws. And on this note, I find it curious that when people try to turn something into a science, which maybe previously wasn't perceived as a proper science, they try to do that by finding laws. So, for example, in the 19th century and early 20th century, there was this intention to have history be a proper science on par with the natural science. The most prominent case of this is probably with the communists, with Marx. And what did Marx try? He tried to find a law of history. He said history isn't just random events. History, he formulated his theory of historical materialism and how history is made by the material conditions, by the economic conditions, by the means of production. And he believed to have found a law of history, a dialectical law, that is, in his case, believing that the contradictions in a society, in an economic system, in a system of production, that these contradictions drive history. And a law always means being able to make predictions, because the law means that B necessarily follows from A. So if I know A happens, I know B will happen, right? If I know you murdered somebody, I can tell you that you will probably go to prison because there's a law saying so. And so Marx believed to be able to predict history in a way. The communist society of the future to him wasn't just a nice utopian idea. It wasn't just about saying, well, we should try to make this true. Rather, there was the belief that this would necessarily come true. History was driving towards this. And just like feudal society had to turn into a capitalistic society after maybe a revolution like the French one, such a capitalistic society again had to sooner or later go through a proletarian revolution and turn to a socialistic society. And he tried to predict this. The prediction being that it would first happen where capitalism was most advanced, so probably in a country like Germany or England. Now, looking back, we can say that the opposite is true. In fact, communists never once rose to power in a fully developed industrial capitalist society. Quite on the contrary, they rose to power in countries like Russia or China that were very underdeveloped, that didn't really have a bourgeois or proletarian class or big industry, but that were more feudal and more agrarian still, which is not something that should have happened if Marx was correct. And I find that communists nowadays just don't care about this contradiction. They, for the most part, just ignore it and don't even try, for the most part, to come up with explanations for this. But even so, Marx may have been wrong. That's not my point here. And also, I don't want to go further into this because this is a Kant lecture, not a Marx lecture. But this is an example for how the wish to turn history into a proper science meant finding laws that govern history and that allow us to predict history. And Marx wasn't the only guy to do this. And this is not just a communist idea. If you want the, let's say, bourgeois alternative for this, you can turn to Kant, who at about the same time, so in the 19th century, came up with his own theory of history, allowing him his own set of predictions, which was also wrong, but that's besides the point here. So if we go with Kant's concept, we would have to somewhat adjust what we see or don't see as a science. I find that the English language here is already more correct than the German one, because in German we call science, that is Wissenschaft, we apply that word to more or less any academic subject. So the word history, for example, means Geschichte, and we totally say Geschichtswissenschaft, historical science. Or we say Literaturwissenschaft, literature science. That is, I think, not quite correct. I would say that anything that does, interpretation, like for example, literature, or something like psychoanalysis, is not a science, it's an art. That's not to say it needs to necessarily be wrong or worthless or unimportant, but it is not a science because it doesn't work with general rules, with general laws. It requires you, as I said early on, to have instinct or judgment, as Kant would say. I can't make a rule for the interpretation of literature and say that this specific metaphor in a poem always has to mean this. Maybe the same metaphor is used in two different poems by two different authors, and in both cases means completely different things. Or in psychoanalysis, I can't just say that this neurotic symptom or this misspeaking, this slip of the tongue always means this, but rather I might have two entirely different people with a different unconscious who share the same symptom or who have the same slip of the tongue once. But in both cases, it means entirely different things. And therefore, I would say this sort of thing, interpretation, is an art, but it's not a proper science. But also, any sort of just doing empirical research and just finding out how things are without being able to tell that they have to be this way is not a science. And here is where I find the English to be more correct. For example, because the English usually speaks of studies here. For example, let's take a subject like religious studies. In German, we call it Religionswissenschaft, but I don't find that to be very correct because here you are studying the phenomenon of religion, or rather of belief, of cult, of rituals, and you are studying it psychologically, ethnologically, sociologically, historically, which is all very neat and interesting and important. Again, I don't want to devalue this. When I say something isn't science, that is not saying it's worthless, because science alone isn't everything. But I think it's more fitting that in English you call this religious studies, because ultimately you are describing, for example, well, this community has this ritual. But you're not explaining they have to have this ritual. There's a law in the human psyche, for example, that makes it necessary for them to have this specific ritual. But I find that even in English, the word science is often applied too broadly, because I would say in the field of so-called natural science, a lot of what is done there isn't really science either, but again, it's studies, it's scholarship. If if a biologist goes into the woods and discovers a new kind of bug, let's say, and studies that bug, studies what it eats, which plants it likes, which plants are poisonous to that bug, and in turn, who eats the bug, which predators hunt this species. All of this is a biological study, but I wouldn't call it science, because if we just empirically observe and study what's happening, we become aware of it, but we don't have actual knowledge of it having to be that way. And only the moment when you start finding laws, describing laws, does it start to become a science, I would say. Now, lastly, I want to end this with a note or a tip of mine. And that is about learning and about remembering. It's a tip I've often given to students, or to people who ask me how I remember stuff, because often people have been amazed and asked me, how do you know so much? Well, the answer is quite simple. Imagine you have a puzzle, and it might even be a complex puzzle. It might be a big puzzle with thousands of pieces. And you had to fit it together. Well, remembering where each single piece belongs would be quite hard. But it's also not necessary. You just need to know the full picture. So you just need to know what the puzzle is supposed to look like at the end. And then you will probably be able, just by looking at the single pieces, to tell where in the whole picture they belong. So by that, what I mean to tell you is, you only really need to learn the system. You need to learn the structure, and then you can easily remember the singular facts. Or rather, you are not really remembering them. You don't have to remember them at all. You are sort of recreating them in your head whenever you need. You, again, saying it with Fichte, you are genetically creating them. So I would tell, for example, students in mathematics, when they are learning how to calculate the area of a rectangle, they learn, well, I have to multiply the side A with the side B. Well, that's all fine. You can learn that. But then you go on to the next thing, and you have to memorize another formula. You are now no longer calculating rectangles. You are now calculating the volume of a cuboid. And now you have to remember a new formula. You have to remember, well, I have to multiply the side A with the side B with the height. And then you have the next thing. You now have to find the volume of a cylinder, for example. And I have often told students, if you try to memorize every single formula, in 12 years of school, you will have 100 formulas. You will forget something. You will confuse something. This is not the way to go. It's better to understand what is happening here, to understand why we are using this formula. Then you only sort of have to remember one basic formula, and you can come up with the other formulas on your own. So, for example, when you have to calculate the volume of a cuboid, you know that you already have the ground, the area of the rectangle that forms the ground. Well, of course you have to multiply it with the height, because the whole thing is just sort of built out of so many slices that all have the same area. So you just have to multiply that ground area with the height of the whole thing. And when you understand that, you don't have to remember how to exactly calculate in case of a cylinder. You just have to think in the same way. Well, again, I have my ground. This time it's not a rectangle, this time it's a circle, but what does that change really? And again, I have to imagine this ground in sort of slices being put above each other so many times as the whole thing is high. So of course I'll multiply this area with the height, and so on. And this doesn't just go for mathematics. This goes for anything. This goes also for philosophy, for history, whatever. As soon as I understand the structure of something, it becomes much, much more easy to remember. I mean, let's take a very simple, even silly example from history. Even if you don't know anything about history, you probably know which of the world wars came first, the First or the Second World War. You don't need to remember that the Second World War came after the First. The very name tells you. And in this way, if you just know 2 or 3 random historical facts, if you know of this battle and of that coronation and of that revolution, you might have a hard time remembering when did they happen, which of those happened first. But as soon as you understand the connection between them, like, did the American or the French Revolution happen first? Well, the French Revolution in part happened because the French king was indebted because he supported the American revolutionaries against the British. So presumably that happened first. So as soon as you understand the structure and the way things are connected, you will have a much, much easier time remembering, or rather recreating in your mind, a lot more things. So this is the tip I want to leave you with for this lecture. And as I said, in the next lecture, I want to talk about philosophy proper. What does philosophy as a science mean to Kant? My deep thanks be to my supporters: Kubilai Celik, Thomas Deuringer, Garnau Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Samit Özkilic, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklärung course.